Extract from Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven by Mark Twain, Chapter 1. Well, when I had been dead about 30 years, I began to get a little anxious, mind you, and I had been whizzing through space all the time, like a comet. Why, Piers, I laid over the lot of them. Of course, there weren't any of them going my way, as a steady thing, you know, because they travel in a long circle, like the loop of a lasso, or as I was pointed as straight as a dart for the hereafter. But I happened on one every now and then that was going my way for an hour or so, and then we had a bit of a brush together, but that it was generally pretty one-sided, because I sailed by them the same as if they were standing still. An ordinary comet don't make more than about 200,000 miles a minute. Well, of course, that's way beyond what it actually makes. Of course, when I came across one of that sort, like Encke's and Halley's comets, for instance, it weren't anything but just a flash and a vanish, you see. You couldn't rightly call it a race. It was as if the comet was a gravel train and I was a telegraph dispatch. But after I got outside of our astronomical system, I used to flush a comet occasionally that was something like, "We haven't got any such comets, ours don't begin." One night, I was swinging along at a good round gait, everything taut and trim, and that the wind in my favor, I judged I was going about 1,000,000 miles a minute. It might have been more. It couldn't have been less when I flushed a most uncommonly big one, about 3 points off my starboard bow. By his stern lights, I judged he was bearing about northeast, and by north half-east. Well, it was so near my course that I wouldn't throw away the chance, so I fell off a point and steadied my helm, and went for him. You should have heard me whiz, and seen the electric fur fly. In about a minute and a half, I was fringed out with an electric nimbus that flamed around for miles and miles, and lit up all space like broad day. The comet was burning blue in the distance, like a sickly torch, when I first sighted him, but he begun to grow bigger and bigger as I crept upon him. I slipped up on him so fast that when I had gone about 150 million miles, I was close enough to be swallowed up in the phosphorescent glory of his wake, and I couldn't see anything for the glare. Thinks I, it wouldn't do to run into him. So shunted to one side and tore along. By and by, I closed up abreast of his tail, and do you know what it was like? It was like a gnat closing up on the continent of America. I forged along. By and by, I had sailed along his coast for a little upwards of 150 million miles, and then I could see by the shape of him that I hadn't even got up to his waistband yet. Why, Peters, we don't know anything about comets down here. If you want to see comets that are comets, you've got to go outside of our solar system, where there's room for them, you understand. My friend, I've seen comets out there that couldn't even lay down inside the orbits of our noblest comets without their tails hanging over. Well, I boomed along another 150 million miles and got up abreast his shoulder, as you may say. I was feeling pretty fine, I tell you, but just then I noticed the officer of the deck come to the side and hoist his glass in my direction. Straight off I heard him sing out, "Below there, ahoy! Shake her up, shake her up. Heave on 100,000,000,000,000 tons of brimstone. A, sir. Pipe the starboard watch. All hands on deck. A, sir. Send 200,000 million men aloft to shake out royals and skyscrapers. A, sir. Hand the stuns'ls, hang out every rag you got. Clothe her from stem to rudder post. Sir. In about a second, I began to see I'd woke up a pretty ugly customer, Peters. In less than 10 seconds, that comet was just a blazing cloud of red-hot canvas. It was, piled up into the heavens, clean out of sight. The old thing seemed to swell out and occupy all space. The sulfur smoke from the furnaces, oh, well, nobody can describe the way it rolled and tumbled up into the skies, and nobody can half describe the way it smelt. Neither can anybody begin to describe the way that monstrous craft began to crash along. And such another pow-pow, thousands of boatswains' whistles screaming at once, and a crew like the populations of 100,000 worlds like ours, all swearing at once. Well, I never heard the like of it before. Sounds like it may have been a spiritual phenomenon with psychological elements, of course. But nowadays we'd say, "Oh, UFO!" Or however you're supposed to say that. I'm not saying it's not possible that there's things from other planets. It's just, if it really is a UFO, we don't know, right? We roared and thundered along side by side, both doing our level best, because I'd never struck a comet before that could lay over me, and so I was bound to beat this one or break something. I judged I had some reputation in space, and I calculated to keep it. I noticed I was gaining as fast now as I was before, but still I was gaining. There was a power of excitement on board the comet. Well, of course, this is fiction. It's not a real event, but there are some accounts like stuff like this happened. Upwards of 100 billion passengers swarmed up from below and rushed to the side and begun to bet on the race. Of course, this careened her and damaged her speed. But wasn't the mate mad? He jumped at that crowd with his trumpet in his hand and sung out, amidships, you are all brain the last idiot of you." The captain could not remember what the word was. He said it was in a foreign tongue. Well, obviously, more swearing, right? Well, sir, I gained and gained, little by little, till at last I went skimming sweetly by the magnificent old conflagration's nose. By this time the captain of the comet had been rousted out, and he stood there in the red glare for'ard by the mate in his shirt sleeves and slippers, his hair all rats' nests, and one suspender hanging, and how sick those two men did look. I just simply couldn't help putting my thumb to my nose as I glided away and singing out, "Ta-ta, ta-ta, any word to send to your family." Peters, it was a mistake. Yes, sir. I've often regretted that it was a mistake. You see, the captain had given up the race, but that remark was too tedious for him. He couldn't stand it. He turned to the mate and says he, "Have we got brimstone enough of our own to make the trip?" "Yes, sir, sure." "Yes, sir, more than enough. How much have we got in cargo for Satan?" 1,800,000 billion quintillions of kazarks. What is a kazark? Very well. Let his borders freeze till the next comet comes. Lighten ship, lively now, lively men, heave the whole cargo overboard. Peters, look me in the eye and be calm. I found out over there that a kazark is exactly the bulk of 169 worlds like ours. They hove all that load overboard. When it fell, it wiped out a considerable raft of stars, just as clean as if they'd been candles, and somebody blowed them out. As for the race, that was at an end. The minute she was lightened, the comet swung by me, the same as if I was anchored. The captain stood on the stern by the after davits and put his thumb to the nose and sung out, "Ta-ta, ta-ta, maybe you got some message to send your friends in the everlasting tropics." Yeah, I have no idea how to sing that one. Then he hove up his other suspender and started for'ard, and inside of 3/4 of an hour his craft was only a pale torch again in the distance. Yes, it was a mistake, Peters. That remark of mine. I don't reckon I'll ever get over being sorry about it. I'd beat the bully of the firmament if I'd keep my mouth shut. But I've wandered a little off the track of my tale. I'll get back on my course again. Now you see what kind of speed I was making. So as I said when I had been tearing along this way about 30 years, I began to get uneasy. Oh, it was pleasant enough, with a good deal to find out, but then it was a kind of lonesome, you know. Besides, I wanted to get somewhere. I hadn't shipped with the idea of cruising forever. First, I liked the delay, because I judged I was going to fetch up in pretty warm quarters when I got through, but towards the last, I begun to feel that I'd rather go to, well, most any place, so as to finish up the uncertainty. Well, one night, it was always night, except when I was rushing by some star that was occupying the whole universe with its fire and its glare, light enough then, of course, but I necessarily left it behind in a minute or two and plunged into a solid week of darkness again. The stars ain't so close together as they look to be. Where was I? Oh yes, one night I was sailing along when I discovered a tremendous long row of blinking lights away on the horizon ahead, and as I approached, they begun to tower and swell and look like mighty furnaces. Says I to myself, by George, I've arrived at last, and at the wrong place, just as I expected. Then I fainted. I don't know how long I was insensible, but it must have been a good while, for when I came to, the darkness was all gone, and there was the loveliest sunshine and the balmiest, fragrantest air in the place, and there was such a marvelous world spread out before me, such a glowing, beautiful, bewitching country. The things I took for furnaces were gates, miles high, made all of flashing jewels, and they pierced a wall of solid gold that you couldn't see the top of, nor yet the end of, in either direction. I was pointed straight for one of these gates, and a-coming like a house afire. Now, I noticed that the skies were black with millions of people pointed for those gates. What a roar they made, rushing through the air. The ground was as thick as ants with people, 2 billions of them, I judge. I drifted up to a gate with a swarm of people, and when it was my turn, the head clerk says, in a businesslike way, "Well, quick, where are you from?" "San Francisco," says I. "San Fran what?" says he. "San Francisco." He scratched his head and looked puzzled. Then he said, "Is it a planet?" "By George, Peters, think of it, planet," says I. "It's a city, and moreover it's one of the biggest and finest and—" There, says he. "No time here for conversation. We don't deal in cities here. What are you from in a general way?" "Oh," I says, "I beg your pardon. Put me down for California." I had him again, Peters. He puzzled a second, and then he says, sharp and irritable, "I don't know any such planet. Is it a constellation?" "Oh my goodness," says I. "Constellation, says you? No, it's a state. Man, we don't deal in states here. Will you tell me where you're from in general, at large? Don't you understand?" "Oh, now I get your idea." I says, "I'm from America, the United States of America." Peters, do you know, I had him again. If I hadn't, I'm a clam. His face was as blank as a target after a militia shooting match. He turned to an under clerk and says, Where is America? What is America? The underclerk answered up in prompt and says, there ain't no such orb. Orb, says I. Why, what are you talking about, young man? It ain't an orb, it's a country. It's a continent. Columbus discovered it. I reckon likely you've heard of him anyway. America? Why, sir, America. Silence, says the head clerk. Once for all, where are you from? Well, says I don't know anything more to say unless I lump things together and just say I'm from the world. Ah, says he, brightening up. Now that's something like what world? Peters, he had me, that time. I looked at him, puzzled as he looked at me, worried. Then he burst out. Come, come, what world? Says I. Why, the world, of course. The world, he says. There's billions of them. Next. That meant for me to stand aside. I done so, and a sky-blue man with 7 heads and only 1 leg hopped into my place. I took a walk. It just occurred to me then that all my myriads I had seen swarming to that gate up to this time were just like that creature. I tried to run across somebody I was acquainted with, but they were out of acquaintances of mine just then. So I thought the thing all over, and finally settled back. They're pretty meek and feeling rather stumped, as you may say. Well, said the head clerk. Well, sir, I says, pretty humble, I don't seem to make out which world it is I'm from, but you may know it from this. It's the one the Savior saved. He bent his head at the name. Then he says gently, the worlds he has saved are like to the gates of heaven in number. None can count them. What astronomical system is your world in? Perhaps that may assist. It is the one that has the sun in it, and the moon and Mars. He shook his head at each name. Hadn't heard of them, you see, and Neptune, and Uranus and Jupiter. Hold on, he says. Hold on a minute. Jupiter? Jupiter? Seems to me we had a man from there 800 or 900 years ago, but people from that system very seldom enter by this gate. All of a sudden he began to look me so straight in the eye that I thought he was going to bore through me. Then he says, very deliberate, did he come straight here from your system? Yes, sir, I says, but I blushed the least little bit in the world. But when I said it, he looked at me very stern and says, that's not true, and this is not the place for prevarication. You wandered from your course. How did that happen? Says I, blushing again. I'm sorry, I take back what I said and confess I raced a little with a comet one day, only just the least little bit, only the tiniest little, so, says he, without any sugar in his voice to speak of. I went on and says, but I only fell off just a bare point, and I went right back on my course again the minute the race was over. No matter that divergence has made all this trouble. It has brought you to a gate that is billions of leagues from the right one. If you have gone to your own gate, they would have known all about your world at once, and there would have been no delay. But we will try to accommodate you. He turned to an underclerk and says, what system is Jupiter in? I don't remember, sir, but I think there is such a planet in one of the little new systems away out in one of the thinly worlded corners of the universe. I will see. He got a balloon and sailed up and up and up in front of a map that was as big as Rhode Island. He went on up till he was out of sight, and by he came down and got something to eat and went up again. To cut a long story short, he kept on doing this for a day or two, and finally he came down and he said he thought he had found that solar system, but it might be fly specks. So he got a microscope and went back. It turned out better than he feared. He had rousted out our system. Sure enough. He got me to describe our planet and its distance from the sun, and then he says to his chief, oh, I know the one he means now, sir. It is on the map. It's called the the wart. I said to myself, young man, it wouldn't be wholesome for you to go down there and call it the wart. Well, they let me in, and they told me I was safe forever and wouldn't have any more trouble. Then they turned from me and went on with their work, the same as if they had considered my case all complete and shipshape. I was a good deal surprised at this, but I was diffident about speaking up and reminding them I did so hate to do it, you know. It seemed a pity to bother them, they had so much on their hands. Twice I thought I would give up and let the thing go, so twice I started to leave, but immediately I thought what a figure I should cut stepping out amongst the redeemed in such a rig, and that made me hang back and come to anchor again. People got to eyeing me, clerks, you know, wondering why I didn't get underway. I couldn't stand this long. It was too uncomfortable. So at last I plucked up courage and tipped the head clerk a signal. He says, "What? You here yet?" "What's wanting?" says I in a low voice and very confidential, making a trumpet with my hands in his ear. "I beg pardon, and you mustn't mind my reminding you and seeming to meddle, but ain't you forgot something?" He studied a second and says, "Forgot something? No, not that I know of." "Think," says I, he thought. Then he says, "No, I can't seem to have forgotten anything." "What is it?" "Look at me," says I. "Look me all over." He done it. "Well," says he. "Well," says I, "you don't notice anything? If I branched out amongst the elect, looking like this, wouldn't I attract considerable attention? Wouldn't I be a little conspicuous?" "Well," he says, "I don't see anything the matter." "What do you lack?" "Lack? Well, why, I lack my harp, and my wreath, and my halo, and my hymn book, and my palm branch. I lack everything that a body naturally requires up here, my friend." Puzzled, Peters. He was the worst puzzled man you ever saw. Finally he says, "Well, you seem to be a curiosity every way a body takes you. I never heard of these things before." I looked at the man a while in solid astonishment. Then I says, "Now I hope you don't take it as an offense, for I don't mean any, but really for a man that has been in the kingdom so long as I reckon you have, you do seem to know powerful little about its custom." "Its customs," says he, "heaven is a large place, good friend. Large empires have many and diverse customs, even small dominions have, as you see, doubtless know by what you have seen of the matter on a small scale in the wart. How can you imagine I could ever learn the varied customs of the countless kingdoms of heaven? It makes my head ache to think of it. I know the customs that prevail in those portions inhabited by peoples that are appointed to enter by my own gate, and hark ye, that is quite enough knowledge for one individual to try to pack into his head in the 37 millions of years I have devoted night and day to that study. But the idea of learning the customs of the whole appalling expanse of heaven, oh man, how insanely you talk. Now I don't doubt that this old custom you talk about is the fashion in that district of heaven you belong to, but you won't be conspicuous in this section without it." I felt all right, if that was the case, so I bade him good day and left. All day I walked towards the far end of a prodigious hall of the office, hoping to come into heaven any moment. But it was a mistake. That hall was built on the general heavenly plan. It naturally couldn't be small. At last I got so tired I couldn't go any farther, so I sat down to rest and begun to tackle the queerest sort of strangers and ask for information. But I didn't get any. They couldn't understand my language, and I could not understand theirs. I got dreadfully lonesome. I was so downhearted and homesick, I wished 100 times I never had died. I turned back, of course, about noon the next day. I got back at last, and was on hand at the booking office once more. Says I to the head clerk, "I began to see that a man's got to be in his own heaven to be happy. Perfectly correct, says he. Did you imagine the same heaven would suit all sorts of men? Well, I had that idea, but I see the foolishness of it. Which way am I to go to get to my district? He called the underclerk that had examined the map, and he gave me general directions. I thanked him and started. But, he says, wait a minute, it's millions of leagues from here. Go outside and stand on that red wishing carpet. Shut your eyes, hold your breath, and wish yourself there. I'm much obliged, says I. Why didn't you dart me through when I first arrived? We have a good deal to think of here. It was your place to think of it and ask for it. Goodbye. We probably shan't see you in this region for 1,000 centuries or so. In that case, au revoir, says I. I hopped onto the carpet and held my breath and shut my eyes and wished I was in the booking office of my own section. The very next instant, a voice I knew sung out in a business kind of way. A harp and a hymn book, pair of wings and a halo, size 13 for Captain Eli Stormfield of San Francisco. Make him out a clean bill of health and let him in. I opened my eyes. Sure enough, it was a P.U.T. engine I used to know in Tulare County. Mighty good fellow. I remembered being at his funeral, which consisted of him being burnt and the other Injuns gomming their faces with his ashes and howling like wild cats. He was powerfully glad to see me, and you may make up your own mind, and I was just as glad to see him, and felt that I was in the right kind of a heaven at last. Just as far as your eye could reach, there were swarms of clerks, running and bustling around, tricking out thousands of Yanks and Mexicans and English and Arabs, and all sorts of people in their new outfits. And when they gave my kit, and I put on my halo, and I took a look in the glass, I could have jumped over a house for joy. I was so happy. Now this is something like, says I. Now, says I, I'm all right. Show me a cloud. Inside of 15 minutes, I was a mile on my way towards the cloud banks and about 1,000,000 people along with me. Most of us tried to fly, but some got crippled and nobody made a success of it. So we continued to walk, for the present, till we had some wing practice. We begun to meet swarms of folk who were coming back. Some had harps and nothing else. Some had hymn books and nothing else. Some had nothing at all. All of them looked meek and uncomfortable. One young fellow hadn't anything left but his halo, and he was carrying that in his hand. All of a sudden, he offered it to me and says, "Will you hold it for me a minute?" Then he disappeared in the crowd. I went on. A woman asked me to hold her palm branch, and then she disappeared. A girl got me to hold her harp for her, and by George, she disappeared. And so on, till I was about loaded down to the guards. Then comes a smiling old gentleman and asks me to hold his things. I swabbed off the perspiration and says, pretty tart, "I'll have to get you to excuse me, my friend. I ain't no hat rack." About this time, I begun to run across piles of those traps lying in the road. I just quietly dumped my extra cargo along with them. I looked around, and Peters, that whole nation that was following me, were loaded down with the same as I'd been. The return crowd had got them to hold their things a minute. You see, they all dumped their loads too, and we went on. When I found myself perched on a cloud with 1,000,000 other people, I never felt so good in my life, says I. Now this is according to the promises I've been having my doubts. But now I am in heaven, sure enough. I gave my palm branch a wave or two for luck, and then I tautened up my harp strings and struck it. Well, Peters, you can't imagine anything like the row we made. It was grand to listen to, and made a body thrill all over. But there was considerable many tunes going on at once, and that was a drawback to the harmony, you understand. And then there was a lot of Indian tribes, and that kept up such another war whipping that they kind of took the tuck out of the music. By and by, I quit performing and judged I'd take a rest, and there was quite a nice, mild old gentleman sitting next to me, and I noticed he didn't take a hand. I encouraged him, but he said he was naturally bashful, and he was afraid to try before so many people. By and by, the old gentleman said he never could seem to enjoy music somehow. The fact was, I was beginning to feel the same way, but I didn't say anything. Him and I had considerable long silence. Then, of course, it weren't noticeable in that place. After about 16 or 17 hours, during which I played and sung a little now and then, always the same tune, because I didn't know any other, I laid down my harp and begun to fan myself with my palm branch, and then we both got to sighing pretty regular. Finally, says he, don't you know any tune but the one you've been pegging at all day? Not another blessed one, says I. Don't you reckon you could learn another one? Says he. Never, says I. I've tried to, but I couldn't manage it. It's a long time to hang to the one. Eternity, you know. Don't break my heart, says I. I'm getting low-spirited enough already. After another long silence, says he, are you glad to be here? Says I. Old man, I'll be frank with you. This ain't just as near my idea of bliss as I thought it was going to be when I used to go to church. Says he, what do you say to knocking off and calling it half a day? That's me, says I. I never wanted to get off watch so bad in my life. So we started. Millions were coming to the cloud bank all the time, happy and hosannaing. Millions were leaving it all the time, looking mighty quiet. I tell you, we laid for the newcomers, and pretty soon I'd got them to hold all my things in a minute. And then I was a free man again, most outrageously happy. Just then I ran across old Sam Bartlett, who had just been dead a long time, and stopped to have a talk with him. Says I, now tell me, is this to go on forever? Ain't there anything else for a change? Says he, I'll set you right on that point very quick. People take the figurative language of the Bible and the allegories for literal, and the first thing they ask for when they get here is a halo and a harp and so on. Nothing that's harmless and reasonable is refused a body here if he asks it in the right spirit. So they are outfitted with these things without a word. They go and they sing and they play just about one day, and that's the last you'll ever see them in the choir. They don't need anybody to tell them that that sort of thing wouldn't make a heaven. At least, not a heaven that a sane man could stand a week and remain sane. That cloud bank is placed where the noise can't disturb the old inhabitants, and so there ain't any harm in letting everybody get up there and cure himself just as he comes. Now, you just remember this. Heaven is as blissful and lovely as it can be, but it's just the busiest place you ever heard of. And, well, we certainly find people limiting their concepts of the hereafter end up doing things like that to their state here and to the states hereafter. Limit spirituality. It's not just the afterlife, but you know what I mean. It's beyond things quite a bit.